Thank you, Ava, for that generous introduction. There's always that moment when you're hearing people talk about you and you feel like that is someone else, so that person, whoever that is, might be somewhat different from the person who's speaking. Also, thank you all for coming. It's a challenge, in a way, to be the person between the coffee break and the dinner, but I'll do my best to make it lively. And I was going to, Ava stole my fire, I was going to talk about the name that we share, which is Chmielewski, and that was my mother's family name. So it really is a pleasure to be here, and I'm very impressed, I have to say, by hearing the history of this institute, and I hope I can contribute a little bit to it. So let me begin by saying that the current moment in the US and elsewhere, let's see if this works. Yeah. The current moment in the US and elsewhere is one in which the issue of representation is part of an overall concern with social justice and what I would call representational inequality. That those who have the ability to represent and those who don't. I won't go into all the calls for representation in the media, but suffice it to say that there are many, and they all come down to a call for more diverse casting, writing more roles in film and theater for underrepresented groups, and an understanding that works about oppressed people need to be created by those self-same people. My position on this is that I fully support representation from a strategic position, but that I'm dubious about the theoretical underpinnings of the idea of representation. And my talk today really will serve to explain my seemingly contradictory position and to, in some sense, defamiliarize the idea of representation, which has become so much the foundation of everything that we do in literary studies. We have a long history of women's lives being written by men, by the very men who may well oppress them. The same is true of enslaved people, colonial subjects, people of color, gay, lesbian, transgender, disabled, deaf, and so on. Chimananda Ngozi Adichie has called this the problem of having only one story available in a particular culture. In her case, she's Nigerian. In addition, she asks, what happens when within that story, the implied reader is not of the culture being written about, and therefore an actual African cannot be imagined as an interlocutor to the characters within the story. That is, the implied reader is not to be African. There are two main arguments about representation. Let me just give the next slide. There are two main arguments about representation. The first is that it's good for oppressed and excluded people to see themselves represented. This can encourage people to see themselves as included rather than excluded. And here you have Whoopi Goldberg's slide about when I was 9 years old, Star Trek came on, I looked at it, and I went screaming through the house, come here, Mom, everybody, come quick, there's a black lady on television, and she ain't no maid. I knew right then and there I could be anything I wanted to be. The other argument is more a complex one. It goes something like this. You have to have lived the constitutive life to understand it, write about it, represent it knowledgeably, accurately, and authentically. This contention has swung back and forth over time. Race has been a prime example. Initially, many of the racialized characters in fiction were primarily written about by people who considered themselves white, although there are some notable exceptions. Even Negro spirituals sang in African American churches could be written by white composers. After several waves of consciousness about the issue, the assumption then became that only people of color could best write about people of color. For example, in 1933, this is the summary of the argument I just made. There's a quote from Fox Fisher, who's transgender, who says, anyone who belongs to an underrepresented group probably feels there's a lack of characters to relate to or that they can resonate with. And you can read the rest of that for yourself. In 1933, when George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess opened on Broadway, Hall Johnson, a black composer, wrote that Gershwin was, quote, as free to write about Negroes in his own way as any other composer to write about anything else, but the work was not a Negro opera by Gershwin. It was Gershwin's idea of what a Negro opera should be. Duke Ellington critiqued the opera for, quote, inventing Negro music, adding, "It's not the music of Catfish Row or any other Negroes." James Baldwin added later the now obvious point that the opera was a white man's vision of Negro life. The point here is that a robust critical pushback from African Americans places the artistic work into a dialectic of critique and acceptance. Now I want to talk about the problem of the issue of authenticity. Claims to authenticity, however, have been disputed by formalists, modernists, or postmodernists who might contest that authenticity is a dodgy game, made even murkier by the questionable assumption that, quote, real or even accurate, quote, representation can be achieved through signs, symbols, icons, and language games. Jacques Derrida, for example, attacks the notion of representation in discussing Artaud's notion of the theater of cruelty. Derrida derides Western civilization's belief that life can be represented in theater and art, saying life is the non-representable origin of representation. How could a writer make characters like me when the you being written about is created out of language, pixels, or paint? Representation will always be several removes away from the original. Stuart Hall points out that representation acts like a language because it substitutes a sign for a thing. Thus, all languages are, according to him, systems of representation rather than direct presentations of reality. E.H. Gombrich has written that all artistic discoveries are not of likenesses but of equivalences, which enable us to see reality in terms of an image and an image in terms of reality. His notion is not of accurate representation of objects, but of equivalences. Georg Lukács wants a complex synthesis in fiction that presents the dynamics of historical materialism, so he sees simple reportage as failing those goals. For him, the psychological novel and the naturalistic novel are too simple to include the dialectical relationship between history and the individual. In the same line of thinking, Louis Althusser's lessons and importance of facts per se and wants to implicate ideology as the grounds in which the dialectic struggle takes place, and he sees knowledge as an abstraction. I'm just running through these people for you. Frederick Jameson values realist representation, but does not posit a one-for-one substitution between the historical world and the fictional world. Instead, Jameson sees the relationship as an analogy. In synthesizing this line of Marxist thinking, June Howard concludes, literary texts, like other texts, are constructed not out of innocent facts, but on the basis of already complex structures of representation. And the operations performed on this raw material in order to produce a novel are specifically literary operations. They are distinct from the operations that would be performed to produce, say, a monograph on genetics or economics or history. And it's inappropriate to expect a narrative to provide knowledge in the same sense. And even one's personal existence, original existence, is composed of memories, experiences, and sensory information that are touched and enhanced by other sets of representations. As Richard Dyer notes, there is no such thing as unmediated access to reality. So this is the kind of formalist and theoretical kind of attack on the idea of authenticity. Is it then pointless to talk about the accuracy or authenticity as a justification for arguments about the importance of diverse representation? So there are at least two approaches to the issue of representation. Let's see if it is. Yeah. One is to see the produced narrative, including the characters, their way of speaking, being, and moving through the world as the issue. The idea is that such a representation, like the characters, about the characters, need to resonate with those who are being depicted and strike them as the accurate or meaningful representation. But another way of seeing this is that the person who's doing the representing, that is the author, needs to be a good and accurate representer. In some ways, these two are linked, since an accurate or true representer will give us a better vision of what is being represented. But in this talk, I'm but there's a further complexity to the issue. If we block out two major functionaries in representation, that is, one, what or who is being represented, and also whom is this representation representing, there are still a few more players. So I'm talking about what I'm calling the quadrilectic, as opposed to the dialectic. So there are four major players. That is to say, the object that's being represented, or the subject that's being represented, the author, and then there are the receivers of the representation, and then the social, political, cultural surround that provides a context and meaning. In effect, rather than a dialectic, there's a quadrilectic with all four elements in constant play and interaction with each other. The representation as a product, a character, object, conversation, or narrative line, will be in dynamic tension with the person who created that representation, as well as with the audience, who will critique and praise the representation. And then you add to that the milieu, which shifts and changes as it both creates an environment in which utterances and representations can be contextualized, and at the same time alters itself to address the changing cavalcade of representations over time. Part of the argument about representation now is that only creators from within a group can make art about that group. The reason generally given is that the work is more authentic. Instead of authenticity, I'd like to argue that it would make more sense, and I think this makes it a better argument, to talk about accountability. The idea of accountability might seem to echo Bakhtin's notion of answerability, and I'm going to just skip over this because it's sort of a small point. In a way, I'm allying myself with Plato, who doubted that the artists were the best people to represent reality. And you all remember that in the Republic, Socrates argued that because artists were not specialists in a particular craft or activity, the results of their mimesis would be flawed, since they were imprecise knowers of what they sought to depict. And the famous example, a shoemaker, as Socrates says, would know much more about shoes than the artist who would paint them or depict them or represent them. What I'd like to propose is that these formalist questions are coming from a position that is necessarily askew. In my book, Resisting Novels, Fiction, and Ideology, I made the point that you don't have to look at the content of novels to find them ideological. Rather, the very structural and formal elements of character, plot, dialogue, and location themselves are imbued with bourgeois values, that novels are ideological from the get-go, regardless of the author's intention. I'd like to clarify that point a little bit more here. Rather than find this determinism, if you will, primarily in the structure of novels, I'd like it to break this down further into what I call ideologemes, which might be analogous to Barth's idea of mythemes. If all works about oppressed groups are written by people who are not of that group, then the building blocks that such authors use to create narrative structures will necessarily be determined by what's available to them and understandable to their audiences. As Dyer writes, representations are presentations, always and necessarily entailing the use of codes and conventions of the available cultural forms of presentation. Such forms restrict and shape what else can be said by and or about any subject of a reality in a given place, in a given society, at a given time. So those preformed little bits of language or predetermined visual images float in the culture like non-material Lego pieces, and are used by individual speakers, writers, and artists to build their constructions. It's rather like the available automobile parts that are used to construct a car. You don't start with stones, dirt, and minerals to build a car. You use ready-made components like computer chips, batteries, and camshafts. Not for electric cars, I don't think there are any more camshafts. Likewise, if you build a novel or a film, you use those small bits of language or imagery that exist in the culture to establish what a person looks like, acts like, thinks like, talks like, and the locations that a person is likely to inhabit. You're also chained, as it were, to narrative features that define something that will be recognizable or even familiar to audiences and to authors as plot. Okay, now here I make a big leap. A really big leap. I want to take a rather historical and even prehistorical step back. If we're talking about representations, we might want to consider the early occurrences of representations of humans and their world. There was a time, so I mean, just to put this in place, because I know a lot of you are not that familiar with human prehistory. So the first Homo sapien appears somewhere between 300,000 and 135,000 years ago. Just try, I mean, the planet's billions of years old, animals have been around way longer. Suddenly we show up 135,000 years ago. First representational art appears 40,000 years ago. So that means that human beings apparently lived either 260,000 years or 100,000 years without representational art. And by the way, I want to point out that those human beings are exactly like us. Their DNA, exactly the same. They looked exactly like us. They were us. We are them, they were us. So you have to imagine a world in which humans are around for a period that, the period without representational art was either 130 times or 50 times the interval in time between us now and Christ, right now. So you just have to multiply. Imagine that time span. No art, no representation. At least none that survived. Okay. It was only after 50,000 years, right, that we see the first representations created by humans. Initially, mostly cave drawings of animals. That's the oldest representation that we have. It's about 45,000 years ago. It's from Indonesia, and it's that's the oldest work of art we have. Think of this period in which humans, existed like us, right? Humans did not begin to create likenesses of themselves as a regular part of their various cultures until about 30,000 to 20,000 years ago. So, these are the famous cave paintings. But it seems like that for the first 300,000 years, there was no need or desire to make a representation of a human being, even though the ability to make a representation was fully available. I'm going to show you, this is one of the early representations of human beings. And I want you to notice something very interesting, which is that the drawing of the animal is fairly elaborate. The human is a stick figure. By the way, it has a bird's head, and it has an erection. So Gregory Curtis writes, creating pictures of people evidently did not interest cave artists very much. The only representations of humans were the occasional stick figure that are aesthetically shockingly different from the beautifully and elaborated rendered animals. As Curtis continues, those stick figures are realistic in their way. They, together with the paintings of animals, show what people thought of themselves in relationship to the world around them, a world ordained for animals and not for people. Here's another picture. This one is actually called the orgy. I don't know if it is or not, but and this one is 600,000 to 400,000 years ago, so we're getting a little closer in time. This was a world where there were very few humans and a superabundance of animals. Paul Bond notes that it's clear from the remarkable detail in the animal pictures that these people were superb artists who could have easily captured a lifelike human face. The fact that they hardly ever did so is generally thought to indicate that there was some sort of taboo operating on accurate portraiture at this period. And I want to focus on this idea that representing humans was initially problematic and that we've grown used to the possibility and elided the actual differences inherent in representation. So in other words, I want to defamiliarize representation for you because we're so used to it and make you understand that it's a relatively new thing in human evolution and in human culture. It's also a world in which you would never see your own face. Where humans do occur in cave art and carving, they are usually faceless. Sometimes male stick figures will have an animal or bird head, as this one does. Female sculptures carved out of clay, stone, bone, or tusk are small enough to hold in the hand are faceless as well. This is one of the earliest sculptures that remain, and you may know it. It had been called the Willendorf Venus. Now in more progressive times we call it the Woman of Willendorf. They're small enough, they're 4 inches tall, small enough to hold in your hand. And by the way, these appear all over the world at around the same period. With pendulous breasts, protruding bellies, thick legs, and large buttocks. None of these figures could be said to be individuals or to represent a specific being. The facelessness of these representations are in startling contrast to our notion of how we represent the humans in art. We are in some sense desperate to create likenesses, to see our face in others' faces. But in a world without mirrors, and with only the opportunity to see one's face in still water or in the eye of the other, and by the way, if you ever try to see your face in water, it's really kind of hard. Paleolithic people would be experts in identifying the other by their face, but never the self. We might think of these stick figures as a kind of writing as opposed to depicting. So I'd like to suggest in a way that either they were, since they were capable artists, why are they drawing stick figures? It's a kind of writing, if you think about it that way. And by the way, I'm not an expert in this. So this is, but on the other hand, if you read deeply in the subject, you realize nobody knows what's going on. It's a typical academic subject. It's very hard to prove anything, lots of arguments about this and that. So I figure I might as well try my own theory. So my theory is that it's a kind of writing. These figures are, in effect, pictograms, not entirely unlike the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. Perhaps it's possible that the very idea of representing the complexity of an individual human being as a two-dimensional daub on a cave wall felt so inaccurate and inadequate that it was not attempted. While Paleolithic people had no problem with the observational and creative act of representing animals whose interior life was unknown or simply irrelevant, you can come in. The sentient being who amounted to a self might have found it ludicrous to put that deeply resonating sensorium and elaborated consciousness on a cave wall. In other words, to represent, if you think about the complexity of yourself, and then you have a cave wall, is whatever you're going to put on there going to represent you or your friends or your relatives? In a way, the humans were kind of saying, like, we can't, representations don't do it. Judith Thurman wrote, Paleolithic artists, despite their penchant for naturalism, rarely chose to depict human beings, and then did so with a crudeness that smacks of mockery. And Barbara Ehrenreich, not known as an expert in the field, did write an essay in which she talked about early humans' sense of humor as manifested in these stick figures and in miniature female statues. Some of them were made from ceramics and were meant to explode when you threw them in the fire. So kind of humans created themselves to become firecrackers. Then, relatively suddenly, there appears in a variety of cultures and locations these small, palm-sized, portable stone carvings of women. The Willendorf woman, which you're seeing here, is that one. The first non-portable, here's something interesting. This is the only thing that we have that are individualized human faces. It's from 14,000 years ago in La Marche, France. And you can see, people have done drawings of it because if you look on the left of the stone, it's incised in the stone, so you can't really see it. So these are the drawings. But they seem like individual faces. But this is this is not the exception that proves the rule. This is the exception that is the exception to the rule. So but basically the first non-portable, more developed representations of people were most likely those done in Mesopotamia about 7,000 years ago. These are primarily female goddesses, followed by representations of notable non-divine figures like rulers, princesses, priestesses, and wealthy citizens. We might say that the representation of human beings, while is so much a part of our culture today, was simply not a major factor until about 8,000 years ago, when it becomes a significant part of many cultures and becomes so widespread that it's no longer remarkable. Yet, among the Abrahamic and monotheistic religions, there is frequently what they call an aniconic tradition, meaning you're not allowed to depict humans or gods. And this is true, of course, in Judaism, and it's true in Islam, involving the prohibition of gods or humans. This is also the case with representations of Buddha in Theravada Buddhism. So this is not a small thing. In other words, there is a large impulse to not represent human beings. Could it be that these early religions saw the technology of human representation as something relatively new and therefore dangerous? What is there about representation that carries this mistrust? And I think there are a couple of more things I want to show you, which is that you may or may not know this, but the Greek statues were colored. They were imbued with color. So when we see them as these white statues, that's not how they were made. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York had a great show. I took these photographs of this is what the statues are meant to look like. And I think that this is sort of a game changer in terms of making art. I mean, obviously the Greeks took it over and they went for it whole hog, which is probably why Plato was questioning it, because it's something very different than that happened in the past. And Aristotle sort of jumps the gun a little bit and changes Plato's thing to say, basically, for the medium being the same and the objects being the same, the poet may imitate by narration, in which case he can either take another personality, as Homer does, or speak in his own person. So Aristotle's idea of mimesis is a way of dodging the problem. In other words, the representation is not real. It's an imitation. And if it's an imitation, you don't have that problem of representation in the way of authenticity, in the way we're talking about it. So there's a couple of other, I want to just talk about a couple of other sort of dynamic moments in representation. This is like a quick boat tour through this subject. But so the next thing I want to talk about is the Eucharist, strangely enough. And there was a big debate, as you probably know, about the Eucharist. The Council of Elvira in 305 to 306 banned representation in the church. So it wasn't just the religions that I talked about were iconic. Actually, the Catholic Church had a ban on images, and the early Protestant Church completely forbid images. So we have to understand that the idea of representing in images is problematic. But what I want to talk, and then the Byzantine Church, H should be there, enforces iconoclasm, banning images twice. So we have a number of religions around the world that are banning images. Okay, to the Eucharist. So, the Eucharist is either a representation or it is the body and blood of Christ, right? So that's a big debate that happens theologically. And Thomas Wycliffe, an English theologian, says, the nature of the bread is not destroyed by what is done by the priest. It's only elevated so as to become a substance more honored. The bread, while becoming, by virtue of Christ's words, the body of Christ, does not cease to be bread. When it becomes when it has become sacramentally the body of Christ, it remains bread. So this is either the idea of transubstantiation, in which the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, or as Wycliffe's saying, it's not actually, it's still bread, it's a representation. The Second Nicene Council said the sacrament after consecration is not the image and antitype of Christ's body, but blood, but is properly his body and blood. And so there's arguments against transubstantiation, there's arguments for it, and then there's also something which I'm not getting into called consubstantiation, which is the idea that it's both bread and flesh at the same time. But anyway, I mean, I think that's an interesting thing because it's the argument, okay, so about the nature of can things represent other things and what are the consequences of that. Now I'm going to move to kind of the 18th century. And I'm suggesting that that there's a connection, more than a casual connection, between the political idea of representation and the notion of authorial representation, which the person who tipped me off of this was W.T. Mitchell, just wrote a short paragraph that said, we now think of representative government and the accountability of representatives to their constituents as fundamental postulates of modern government. One obvious question that comes up in contemporary theories of representation, consequently, is the relationship between aesthetic or semiotic representation and political representation. Like in aesthetic, things stand for other things, and in political representation, persons act for other people. In some sense, Mitchell is rephrasing Gayatri Spivak's use of Kant's term to make a distinction between Vertretung and Darstellung as two types of representation, the former being political representation and the latter being aesthetic representation. So here I want to expand the quest to include, is there a coincidence between the beginning of the novel in the 18th century and the consolidation of representative democracy in the same period? In both, a person is given or takes power to represent another person or group of people. In a direct democracy, if you had a direct democracy, each citizen would represent themselves, but we don't have a direct democracy, we have a representative one. In writing, so a direct democracy would be as if you wrote your own story. However, with the rise of the novel and the development of the publishing industry, a direct writing public is displaced to a representative authorship in which certain individuals, that's to say authors, gain cultural capital by representing the lives of others. If we think of the early emphasis on epistolary fiction, we might understand that early fiction writers like Samuel Richardson or Francis Burney might have been trying to hijack direct writing to this new and unique form of fiction, because they wrote in this letter form, and the letters look like letters, so you think, and often they lied and said that they were real. I mean, Defoe does that all the time. In so doing, the author represents the activity of ordinary direct letter writers, and in the process makes himself or herself a representer of that activity. To think this through, he could revise the motto of the American Revolution by converting no taxation without representation to no novelization without representation. A bit awkward, but it has some relevance. Because when Western bourgeois society was concerning itself with the issue of political representation, the novel as a form was developing. Indeed, the word representation was first used by Edmund Burke in 1769 in the political sense we know, according to the OED, which defines the term as the action, fact, or right of being represented or representing others in a legislative or deliberative assembly. At the same time, the novel was concerned with the problem of representing the individual in a parallel process, rendering the life of an individual and representing it in language. I did an engram charts here, which you can see using the words representative, representation, author, and reader. And you can see they all kind of, I wouldn't say dramatically, but at least with the author term, they all spike around the same time, or they increase around the same time. Ngram's not the most reliable source, but it gives us an idea that the confluence of the notion of representation and narrative held a distinct interest among those who were writing and reading books at the time. In order to solve the problem of representation and the accuracy of that representation, writers had to engage in a kind of dialectic between factuality and fictionality, which I discussed in my first book, Factual Fictions. If there was a productive ambivalence between the factuality of the work and the credence of the reader, novelists could make the claim that the work was true. Its contents could be instructive and useful. Claiming the novel was true was a way of asserting that its representation was accurate. When the quote-unquote editor of Robinson Crusoe claims the work is actually a real document, he bypasses the dodgy issue of representation, right? Because it's not a representation, it's the actual thing itself. Something is not a representation if it's a fact or simply a presentation. To represent a person or a situation, an author must claim a certain privilege or right. Oh, there we go. I shamelessly put my book up there between Pamela and Robinson Crusoe. When the editor of Robinson Crusoe claims the work is actually a real document, he bypasses, I said that. To represent a person or situation, an author must claim a certain privilege or right, which in turn is granted to the writer by groups of readers. When novelists were working out these problems, at the same time, political thinkers in the US, like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, were hashing out the Federalist Papers. I don't know if you've ever read the Federalist Papers. They're kind of fascinating. They're this group of young men who are sort of inventing the American representative democracy and arguing about all of this stuff and the details of how political representation might work. In this sense, they were working out similar problems to those faced by novelists. If there were individuals who were to be both governed and governing, how should their being and wishes be represented in a government? In other words, like, how does a person who's a representative, in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, but particularly the House of Representatives, how do they represent the wishes and the desires of their constituents back home? And what's the best form to do that? And there's a similar problem of accuracy and veracity we find in novels in the way that citizen readers choose individual characters to represent their wishes, desires, and opinions. I'll just give you an example. Madison was worried that there might be a misalignment in representation because the type of person chosen by election might not correctly represent the interests of those who had cast their votes. And we do know that this is a serious problem in government today, right? As he wrote, quote, "Those who administer government may forget their obligations to their constituents and prove unfaithful to their important trust. Likewise, and then they get into a whole kind of thing about numbers, like how many people could one person accurately represent And you know, and then how often do you have to re-elect the person? I mean, because the states at the time, they had, you know, some states you were re-elected every 6 months, some you were re-elected every 4 years. So they had to come up with, like, what's the most accurate way where that person could really keep their finger on the pulse of their constituents. I'm not saying that the reading public and the voting public were identical in the 18th century, and I'm not claiming that the process of political representation and literary representation facilely map onto each other in that era. But this framework allows us to understand something about the process of representation and the issue of accuracy. In some sense, we might be able to reframe the argument about accuracy and authenticity. This is my correction to the problem of accuracy and authenticity, because as I said, it's very hard to prove that something is accurate or authentic, right? There's just so many, and I gave you that list of all of the sort of formalist, postmodern critiques of that concept. So in some sense, we might be able to reframe the argument about accuracy and authenticity if we think of the problem from the point of view of those who are represented in narrative. If they concur with the author's representation, they will buy books and, as a demographic, approve of the depiction of themselves in narrative form. This is less, in fact, about accuracy as it is about accountability. Representational inequality, what I've called representational inequality, can be seen as a constantly fluctuating problem tied to the demographic representation of readers. The point is that readers will drive attitudes toward various marginalized and dominant identities. White middle-class readers in the 19th century, for example, supported writers who would convey to them their own experience of the world, including their view or imagined view of the poor, women, people of color, colonized and enslaved people. So it's kind of circular, right? You know, and there is this thing where by buying the books and supporting the author, I would even use the term electing the author, because, you know, our canonized authors are in some sense elected by us. It's a lot more complicated than that. In this regard, okay, I'm going to skip that. If I'm postulating a kind of shadow democracy based on literary models, is what I'm discussing already conceptualized by Habermas and his idea of the public sphere? Or could one argue, one could argue that the public sphere, with its coffee houses, magazines, pamphlets, and the like, amount to a kind of humanistic government outside of government? While that may be true, the public sphere isn't based so much on the concept of a single writer representing the wishes of a group of people who buy that writer's work and therefore choose that writer as a representative spokesperson. The public sphere is made of a vast variety of dialogic voices. These may or may not include the fictional characters whose lives represent the world the readers live in. If there is representation at all, it's through the persona of writers who might assume names like Publius or Isaac Biggerstaff. But recreating a world within a book isn't the job of the public sphere, although some novels, for example, might come to represent or stand for positions espoused in the public sphere. So what I'm proposing is this kind of refutation of, or an attempt to explain this theory of representation without having to rely on authenticity. And it's not exactly reader response that I'm talking about either. While most identity groups have now been incorporated into the reading franchise, as it were, the one group, I would say two groups that remain outside of the paradigm were disabled people and poor people. In that sense, both as voters and consumers of art and culture, they can't vote on their representation by consumption or at the polls, nor can they engage in the public sphere, which would allow their issues and lived experiences to be accurately represented in the representational sensorium. In fact, in actual voting, only 20% of poor people, for example, vote in political elections in the United States. How many fewer vote for cultural representations? It's also important to note the state of affairs can change through the withdrawal of consent or the ratification of new representatives. And when and if that withdrawal happens, then these issues being raised here would become moot. In other words, this isn't a permanent situation, but one dependent on complex political, social, and personal mix of interactions and concatenations. It might be fair to complain about what I've presented. What if middle-class writers, like, for example, who are writing about poor people, got it wrong, but their efforts achieve some kind of social or economic change that helps poor people? it's sort of like the argument, didn't Dickens help reform some of the worst abuses of the poor laws? Didn't Dorothea Lange's photographed migrant mother call attention to starving pea pickers and their plight in California? Isn't this simply one argument in the long line of leftists decrying the bourgeois function of literature and art under capitalism or neoliberalism? To buttress this objection, one might want to cite, for example, Lynn Hunt's book, Inventing Human Rights, A History, which argues in part that novels in the 18th century helped create human rights by fostering empathy. Or Steven Pinker, who himself quotes Hunt, saying that whether or not novels in general, or epistolary novels in particular, were the critical genre in expanding empathy, the explosion of reading may have contributed to the humanitarian revolution. While there's some truth to these points, its flaws for me are manifest. How would we measure the effectiveness of art in achieving change? Is this change that the poor want? If someone's writing for change, is this the change that let's say, the poor as a demographic want? Is the relief structured by them or thrown at them? Is it structured by them or thrown at them? And how much does the fame and effectiveness of the middle-class spokesperson for the poor or for any oppressed group crowd out and prevent the possibility that organic intellectuals from oppressed groups could come to occupy the public and prominent place being held by their unelected doppelgangers? It is here that the idea of accountability instead of authenticity comes into play. Would not the authors and readers have to grapple with a level of accountability in which authors would have to discuss their ability to depict the oppressed group they are representing? And I like this term invented by Veena Das, who says that it's just a critique of kind of anthropology and social workers, that she likes this idea of dwelling. Like if you need to dwell with the group that you are writing about, for example. So instead of dwelling with oppressed groups, they're selling the group. So there's like a big difference between dwelling and selling. Another argument against the points that I've made might be that, maybe the writers are just better writers. Maybe middle-class writers or, people from other, dominant groups are better writers. I've had people say that to me. And I think it's pretty obvious that that's not a strong argument, because all you have to do is look at the growth of writers within various oppressed groups once they have some cultural capital, and we know that they are more than competent. I'm exploring the complexities around the idea of representing any oppressed group, and in my longer work, I make three categories. One is the exo-writer, one is the endo-writer, and one is the trans-writer. So the exo-writer is writing from outside, the endo-writer is writing from within that group, and the trans-writer can be someone who was writing from within the group but has moved out of the group. I have a lot. There's an algorithmic equation there that's quite complicated, and I won't go into it here. But my point is that representation is a complex process by which authors are chosen by reading demographics. I think I haven't showed you a new slide. This is just talking about the 19th century as being the height of sort of a kind of realism that really claims that it is representing. It is representing the groups that it tries to represent. And then we have in the 20th century and modernism the idea that, hey, we can't represent, but we can write, and we can try at something like maybe reproducing not the real world, but the internal psychological world of people. So it's a very complex process, and often these expectations can change over time and various kinds of political and social pressures. So rather than thinking of representation as an act of authenticity, it might be more apt to think of it as a combination of responsiveness to a demographic or demographics and accountability to such. In addition, the presence of the authorial sensorium of ideologemes will pre-craft certain kinds of narratives by providing only a limited set of tools to build representations. In this case, stories about minoritized groups will only seem real or accurate if they're filled with ideologemes that match reader genre expectations. This filling is a sublimation of the inability of writers and visual artists to depict something like lack, as in the case of poor people. Therefore, authors might not be in full control of the representations they present, and therefore might be unrepresentative representers. Representative equality will then depend on the extent to which the author or writer or artist depicting social justice abuse is dwelling with and justly representing not the expectations of the dominant group readers, but those of the oppressed people to whom they are accountable. I hope I've shown that representation is strategically important to further the identity of unrepresented groups, but it is also, at base, theoretically difficult to maintain. We live during a time, well, one thing I didn't talk about, but we could certainly talk about in the Q&A, is AI. Like, that is a whole issue about representation. I was just reading the paper today that Drake, have you seen this on Instagram? That somebody made a song, what was it called? Something About My Heart, that Drake is supposed to sing, but it was really totally created by AI. So that's another issue. But we live during a time when two opposing ideas are being deeply held. One, that representation matters, and two, that you can't trust representation. These are not beliefs held by diverse demographics, but rather being held, in the case of progressives, simultaneously. In this sense, progressives must live in a world of negative capability in which two opposing concepts must interact dialectically while at the same time producing a resolution that makes sense from a social justice perspective. It's a tricky balancing act, but given the complexity of the situation I'm describing, it's a most necessary one. Many. As many as you want.
As many. So this is, thank you so very much for, as always, a very inspirational and fascinating lecture. This is the time for questions